Well, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the final panel session of what has been an absolutely amazing event. But hopefully the best is yet to come, and we're going to talk now about the practicalities of decision-making in real-world context, and hopefully laying the groundwork for the final session of the day, which is going to be Dave Good and Mervyn King talking about what is to be done, what can academia and government do together to improve the quality of decision-making in situations of radical uncertainty. So I'm Carla Groom, and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Behavioural Science at the Department for Work and Pensions. And those of you who were here for yesterday's sessions might remember Gus O'Donnell lamenting the fact that there were so many economists in government and very few other disciplines like psychologists. And in fact, this is part of the reason why I'm here today, is because there was a Director General at DWP who was also thinking that if there were problems that economics hadn't yet cracked, then he should bring in underrepresented disciplines and see if he could give them a stronger voice in policy making. So that's where my team was born. Behavioural science designed by and for DWP doesn't look an awful lot like behavioural science teams would anywhere else. And one of the first things that I did in 2015 was I have a PhD in experimental psychology, but I went to find some more people who had relevant training and degrees. So in the front row here, I have Dr. Kaylee Edmondson, who has a joint degree, joint training in anthropology and psychology. So is already starting to bring that diversity to our team. And she's going to be helping me keep an eye on the questions while I keep an eye on our wonderful panelists. And just to give a little bit of context about what it is that I do, because I do see our team as providing a bit of a bridge between some of the themes that have come up in this event, between academia and ideas and theory and data, and also then actual real-world decisions. And I did spend a good 10 years in DWP in various kinds of policy and academic and analytical roles before I set up this team. So I have been at the coalface of what it's like to make decisions in a crisis, or decisions over billions of pounds in pension reforms, for example. And our team is set up around a single problem statement. And this is an observation that we found. Thought this is a real problem that everyone can agree is a problem that no existing professional function already owned. And that's that the department sometimes makes decisions based on assumptions about behaviour that aren't true. And that feels like a really useful lens through which to look, at least for me, to look at everything we've been covering in the past 2 days. And what we found in trying, failing, succeeding in our team with trying out different approaches is that there's sort of 3 magic ingredients that really seem to help to combat that problem. One of them is social science training, and that's why my guys come from backgrounds of psychology, sociology, anthropology, geography, linguistics, and more. But it's also design thinking, and I'm really pleased here that we've also got my academic collaborator Lucy Kimball at the back of the room as well, who is my source of all knowledge on design thinking. And then we also find that systems thinking is really useful. So that systems, design, and social science blend seems to, in practice, have magic powers to help us to crack problems that weren't crackable before. And I think today we've got an unbelievable range of experience and research here at this table, and we'll be touching on all 3 of those themes. So what we're presenting are pilot projects that were part of the original cruise network idea, and they were conducted a few years ago because obviously COVID has delayed this meeting. So what we're going to do is to spend the first hour and a half looking at what was found in the project, starting with Kris Meyer's work and Ben Bowles, who both collaborated with the Cabinet Office, and then Tobias and Erica, who've worked with humanitarian agencies. So both working in very difficult decision-making contexts, bringing really innovative approaches to how to think about the future and how to take actions in the context of that future. And what we're going to do is to go through those in kind of quick whistle-stop tour fashion, then have Q&A and discussion about that. And I'm hoping by the end of the first hour and a half that some themes might be starting to come out, and indeed we've already had chats before about some of what we think are some of the cross-cutting themes here. And then to take a bit of time in the break to come back and then say, well, what are the problems, ideas, questions, principles that we need to embrace in order to start making practical progress on improving decision-making where it really matters. and what in fact are the contextual factors that help us to decide when something is going to be more useful than something else. So at DWP, I make no apologies for the fact that our behavioural science team looks really different to the way it does in other departments, and that's because our department is really, really different. The kinds of problems we work on are different. The size of the analytical support we have was different. So I'm hoping that we can kind of do looking back and then looking forward throughout this session and set up a really good groundwork for Mervyn and David to leave us with some final messages today. So without further ado, let's get started on really exciting work that Kris is going to talk about. So Kris Meyer is a neuroscientist, science communicator, and director of the UCL Climate Action Unit. And this is really creative stuff that I think you're going to really enjoy. And he's going to tell us about his work, helping to think about what would happen in the case of a power outage.
Thank you, Carla. So I started out as a neuroscientist, but as you see, I'm now I'm heading up the Climate Action Unit at UCL. And the main reason for that is that about 12 years ago, working on brain models, I started to really wake up to the fact that the things that I knew about neuroscience didn't seem to have all that much of an impact on the big problems in society. And I started to get more and more interested in that question of how do you bridge that gap? How do you drive these insights really into the world of decision-making, into the world of communication, and specifically on climate change? That is one of the reasons why I joined the Cruise Network with David and Lenny back in 2015, I think we started. And I learned a lot in sitting in those meetings and listening to real decision-making problems and contexts in which decisions were made on very little information. And it led, amongst other things that we were doing, to setting up the Climate Action Unit, where we are not a research unit. We are not doing any research, which is kind of unusual in an academic institution. We are, for lack of a better word, and reaching back for the words that David used yesterday, a silo buster unit. We are professional silo busters. Our work is all about getting people to collaborate from different sectors, from different disciplines in academia, but also working then with policy, with finance institutions, with business world, with third sector organizations. And I sometimes describe us as like climate plumbers. We are unblocking the pipes of communication where the communication currently isn't flowing in the way that it should. And sort of from a disciplinary background, we're magpies. We steal anything that works and we try to put it into practice. And by doing so, we then start generating some impact that actually does start looking like research again, and that actually then we're starting to feed back into the academic literature, but it's not our prime focus. Our prime focus is always solving problems in the real world. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today as SHUTDOWN, one of the projects that we did as part of the Cruise project, but that is part of a stream of similar projects that I'll briefly mention as well. And the way that SHUTDOWN came about is that as part of the problems that Lenny and David were discussing in the Cabinet Office, that the Cabinet Office people said, well, we'd really like to get some answers on this, but we don't know where to get the answers to this, is how would the public react to a nationwide power failure? So in the National Risk Register that we've been hearing about a few times already, that nationwide power failure is pretty much near the top of the kinds of risks that can be befalling the UK. And when it happens, the kind of thinking is that it would at least for 7 days knock out the electricity grid around the whole country before it could be brought online. And it might actually be a lot longer than 7 days. And so when the Cruise Network published these calls for these mini projects that were really trying to answer the questions of decision makers, on this one they didn't get any applications. And the reason for this is that this is of course not a context where you can use the usual tools of social science, going to ask people with a survey or with a focus group. You can ask them, how are you going to be responding in a situation that you don't have direct experience of? And I'll come to some of the psychological reasons for that in a second. But at the same time, around that time, I was working with interactive theater makers in a piece that will be an important kickoff point for the way that we build this SHUTDOWN scenario. So the way that we did this piece of research with the Cabinet Office, we really started with the questions of the Cabinet Office first. We went to the staff that is responsible for that particular risk, and we sat down with them and we said, what is it that you need to know specifically, in a very specific way? And they said, well, how do we need to communicate about the use of, or making sure that people don't eat food that will give them food poisoning when all of the cooling installations go out? How do we make sure that no one poisons themselves by putting a diesel generator in their home and gets monoxide poisoning? How do we make sure that people don't flock to hospitals, which would be the only places with electricity at that time, and go and plug in their mobile phone to charge it, which had actually happened in a previous small blackout in Lancaster some years ago. So it was those very precise questions that were the questions that the policymaker was asking, and we built a whole project around developing a tool that would answer those particular questions. Now, I mentioned the psychological difficulties of why you can't just go and ask people, well, will you go to the hospital to charge your phone? Will you run upstairs and fill your bath when you hear that the water's about to run out? And the reason for that is a version or one other of what is called the intention-behavior gap, or the say-do gap, which many, many studies in psychology for about 70 or 80 years have been showing, that you can't just ask people, how are you going to behave in a situation where you're currently not in? And specifically to this one, nationwide power failure, a situation where you don't have any experience of whatsoever. And so trying to close that intention-behavior gap, trying to circumvent it, was part of the thing that we were trying to do with this. Our response to this was to turn questions about how are you going to behave in the future in this situation that you don't know into judging other people that have lived through something in the past. And I will come to the significance of that in a second. But so we really turned future into past and imagination of that unimaginable context into judging other people. And I mentioned already that before we did SHUTDOWN, I developed another project with these theater makers, interactive theater company, and that was called the Justice Syndicate. And that was a situation in which you put a group of people in a context that is really ambiguous. It was framed as a court case. You were given evidence about a particular accused person, and it's very ambiguous. There are some things that go against him, there are some things that speak for him, and it's not really easy to make decisions. And the reason why I had started to work with these interactive theater makers on that particular project was that they were interested in making some good theater, and I was interested in bringing ideas from psychology into the way that people are thinking about the ways that they reach decisions. And what we saw in doing more than 80 sessions of the Justice Syndicate in theaters, in art festivals, in science festivals, in film festivals, sometimes in universities, is a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about for the last 1.5 days. So every session has its own groupthink. Every session has its own flavor of the kinds of arguments that are being discussed. And having seen 80 of those sessions, I'm still not bored with watching them because everyone is different. And groupthink doesn't mean that everyone reaches a consensus. Sometimes the groupthink splits in two conviction narratives where the two groups are starting to battle it out. And sometimes it converges on one conviction narrative, and there is sort of a consensus building in that group. And that's always based on the same evidence, on this exact same evidence. And if you look at the group results for these 80 plays, it's almost like a flat distribution from all the way guilty to all the way not guilty and anything in between. When we did the first trial of this Justice Syndicate, which was just before I went to a cruise meeting where David was talking about the power failure problem, I immediately saw that this is not just like a theater show, this is actually an incredibly powerful research tool as well. And that then led us to sort of suggest to David that we could be tackling this SHUTDOWN problem, or this problem of the nationwide power failure, within what we now call the syndicate format. So I still work with the theater company. They're called Fast Familiar. These days they call themselves an experience design company. But this particular format that we are using to bring people together, we call that the syndicate format. And before I go to the shutdown narrative, I first want to introduce how it actually works. So this is what you would see if you come in a room and there's a table with tablets around, and you've got a seat and you can sit down in that seat. And you'll usually be like a juror or a panel member, the decision board for a company, or an advisor to a prime minister, or in the case of shutdown, a panel of citizens that comes together to vote on who is going to be the citizen of the blackout, who is going to get like the prize of being the most noble citizen in that situation. And so you come together, you sit at the table, and you get the tablet, the digital tablet in front of you, and then you start being given little bits and pieces of information in video format, in documentary format, sometimes audio. And the further you get into a piece, the more you are being asked to make decisions, and the more that you are being asked to discuss with other people specific questions. And the type of questions that we're asking are always very much dependent on the scenario that we are bringing out. This is sort of the interface of the tablet. So it's very professional, very slick looking, very good technology, very good user design that has gone into this, or interface design. And you can see that you've got to vote and you've got to discuss, etc. So with that in mind, the shutdown story. What did we do with this national blackout? So as I mentioned, rather than asking people to imagine the unimaginable, we asked them to judge 5 citizens from a village called Cawley Heights, who had done some smart things and some really stupid things during the blackout. And all of the storylines were directly linked to the questions that the Cabinet Office was asking. And I'll play one audio clip and then one video clip of the platform to give you a sense of what is happening with what people get to see. This is the opening. This is the very first thing that people get to hear.
This is a national emergency broadcast. It is Friday, 6 a.m. The national power failure that began late last night continues this morning. An initial statement from Cobra suggests that the outage is likely to have been caused by heavy storms yesterday. It is not thought that a threat to national security was involved. The international terror threat has not been raised to critical and remains at severe. At present, Cobra cannot confirm when power will be restored. There will be widespread disruption to road travel due to failure of traffic signalling. Public transport networks are affected. Trains are not running and the airports are closed. Some bus services are running. Cobra advises strongly against non-essential travel. Mobile telephone networks are down. Landline services are seriously affected. In those areas where fibre optic cable has replaced copper wire, telephones will not work. The chief executive of Sainsbury's, Michaela King, has announced that all branches of the supermarket will not open today. It is anticipated that many other shops will remain closed today. Cobra will release further information later this morning, and hourly emergency broadcasts will continue on BBC Radio channels 1 to 4.
So this was a typical, this is the typical message that you would hear on a radio if you had a radio with batteries still operating, typical message that you would hear on the BBC in that particular situation. And it sets the scene of all the bad things that are going to happen as a result of the national electricity, or the electricity going off. As I mentioned, the piece was situated in Cawley Heights, and you were introduced to about 5 different citizens, residents of that place. And I'm going to play you the clip of one of them who responds to, or who talks about how he responded in that situation.
Well, we were still open. It was 10:30 on the Thursday, and we shut at 11. And we've got these big freezers, and if they're off for more than 30 minutes, then the food can be ruined. You can't sell it, in case it makes people sick, and then they sue you. So by 1 a.m, I knew we were in trouble. Well, not in trouble, but, I'd phoned the energy company and they just had this recorded message, so I put 2 and 2 together and worked out that something, untoward had happened.
Okay, so this is the kind of message that you get, and the further you go into the piece, the more color, the more detail there is to the kind of things that are happening. And as I mentioned, some of them do good things and some of them do stupid things within the context of the story. And I think he ends up giving food away that ends up food poisoning some people. So that's the way to bring in these things that the government or the Cabinet Office wanted to have answers on. Now, as I mentioned, there is sort of voting and discussion and data gathering during the piece. And this is one of the types of questions that we're asking. How are people thinking that the person they've just heard has been resourceful or not? How have they been doing a good thing or a bad thing? And that gives sort of an indication of how people are judging the behavior of other people as a means to bypass some of that intention behavior gap. I'll give some examples of that in a second. But before I do that, a little exploration of why we did what we did. So we didn't want to create the physical reality of a blackout because that's really not very easy. That's very hard. And to give people that sense of prolonged not having electricity would have been almost impossible and also unethical probably at the same time. So what we do is we create a social reality for them. And what we heard from Katharina before is that the social mechanisms in our brain are very deeply rooted in stuff that begins really early in life. And that's the stuff that we're playing into with asking people the question, how do you feel about what that person just did? How do you feel about what that person just said? So that really helps us to bypass that imagination of the future that we don't know how to do very well and turns it into the judging of people. The next thing that is really important is that if you want to good answers from people, you need to ask very concrete questions. If you ask very big questions, you get very poor answers. So all of the story elements were super short, brought the mind's attention to only a few things, and then asked a very concrete question for people to decide or to discuss. And then you get very rich answers on those things that you want to get the answers to. So for example, coming back to the food example, when people are discussing how stupid someone has been who has made half of his village have food poisoning, you get sort of like a sense of how well they would be prepared for that situation, how well they would be taking steps to avoid that particular situation. We also tested particular ways of messages that the government would be using in that context. So for example, one of the things they wanted to know, as I mentioned before, is will people go and fill up their baths? When you tell them, please don't fill up your bath, the answer is yes. Almost everyone would run immediately upstairs to open their bath and to fill it because they don't want to be the last household that runs out of water. But on the other hand, if you ask people not to go to the hospital to go and charge their phones, actually most people will stay at home. So because of the way that they're responding to a story of someone else in the story doing that. This isn't role-playing. In none of the projects that I do with the theatre makers, we do role-playing. And the reason is that role-playing is a really inaccurate way to get to information because, again, you're asking people to imagine themselves in a context they don't have direct experience of. I often hear a lot of people say, oh, we need role-playing in scenarios. No, you need to build scenarios that come as close as possible to the lived experience of people. And finally, the quality is really important. If you ever want to do this, work with good artists because you do need good story production and acting in there. What is also very important in all of the pieces that we're doing is the debrief. So after every participation in this immersive experience, we are putting people in sort of what the social psychologists in the 1950s and 60s used to call a debrief. You explain people why you did the experiment in a certain way. And the reason why that is important is that all of the literature on experience-based learning, which is tens of thousands of papers, breaks down based learning into giving people an experience and then giving the opportunity to reflect on that experience. If you just give people the experience, it isn't going to lead to learning in a predictable way. And in the debrief, we're allowing that reflection to happen. So, the shutdown was really, the purpose of shutdown was to get some answers for the Cabinet Office on how people would respond to that situation that they weren't getting answers to from other researchers. And it worked really well, and David came to one of the sessions, and I don't know if you remember, David, but you said afterwards, I found myself thinking and saying things that I had never thought before. And that's really what the group context, the immersion, and then the group discussion and the group context bring out in us. We start thinking thoughts that we hadn't thought before on our own. Unfortunately for the project, when this was finally up and running, Brexit planning kicked in, and our entire Cabinet Office team was diverted to a different department, and we lost all of our contacts. So none of the insights we actually gathered became implemented in policy, and that is a sorry outcome, but at least the research had worked. Anyway, what this experience led to was us developing a lot of other scenarios that do different things. So for instance, when harm happens, plays in an NHS context, and it really is to help clinical practitioners have an experience of a situation that almost certainly sometime in their lives they're going to be exposed to. What if someone dies in their care? And how do you judge that? How do you make sense of whether a mistake was made or not? And this goes back to what Gert yesterday was talking about in terms of like, if you want to become an expert in something, you need to have lived experience of that. And when harm happens, creates that lived experience for creative practitioners. If I Were You is a tool to help young people, young adults practice their perspective taking, which is a capacity in the human brain that can be trained, so that's what that tool does. Do What You Must is a decision-making tool on climate change for businesses. And what is really interesting about that one is that we have two versions of exactly the same scenario. In one version, we're scaffolding all the decisions and the discussions with principles of good decision-making that come out of the vast literature on psychology and decision-making. And we're building that into the way that we're asking people to discuss. In the other scenario, we don't support their decision-making at all. We put a big question on the table and we let them fight it out. And what we're, lo and behold, what we're seeing, of course, is that in the scaffolded decision-making context, the conversations are much richer. People come much later to sort of entrenched positions, and there is less of a group effect than in the unsupported decision room. Of course, decision-making becomes a bit harder in the supported room because you're now exposed to more of the facts that you need to take into account in reaching that decision. And then policy pathways, I call it a virtual gym for policymakers on climate policy, and I'm going to talk a minute about that, and then I'm going to stop. It's a tool that we developed because we had been doing work with Chatham House on putting climate risk information in front of briefing officials of heads of government. And we saw that the climate risk information wasn't driving any greater ambition or any sense of like, yes, we need to do more, we can do more. It was leading into the responses, we're already doing everything we can do, or we're already doing everything we have to do. And stop telling us how bad the situation is going to be, we already know that. And then we put, when we ran into that problem, we started putting like action pathways in front of them, like places where they could intervene with smart policy to drive the decarbonization of the energy system. And they weren't taking it up. They were saying, well, it may have worked in Norway, it may have worked in that country, but that's never going to work over here. So what we did then is we decided that like we needed to make the decision-making as concrete as possible to get them to practice how taxation, subsidies, regulation can drive decarbonization of the energy system in a much smarter way than it is doing today. And whereas the the concrete decision context is helping some people. So recently we had a Treasury official say, well, I thought that climate change was going to be solved through the markets, and now, having taken part in this, I realized that that might not be the case and that there is a role for governments to drive climate policy. Shocker, but that happened. So we are getting some sort of breakthroughs with individuals, but still orthodoxies and conviction narratives that exist within different sectors are getting in the way. And when we recently played it with a group of finance ministry people and central bank people, the central bank people were all in favor of the finance ministry actions, and the finance ministry people were all in favor of the central bank actions. And the reason is that you can pass the buck to someone else, and you know how difficult your decision-making context is, but you don't realize that the decision-making context of the other people is as difficult. I could talk a day about this. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to hand over to Carla.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, and we will get into proper discussion later. But just a couple of things that struck me from that, and one is the innovation in the methods that you developed to solve the real world problem, and not just kind of, okay, well, I've got a hammer so everything looks like a nail. I'm actually going to come up with something that hasn't been done before and make it work. And the other was the work that you did to help the Cabinet Office specify what they really wanted to know. So I think you have to be creative in both the process of coming up with the answers, but also the process of drilling down into the questions. So much more we could talk about, but before we do, we're going to hand over to Ben Bowles, who is a social anthropologist at SOAS and is also a research fellow at the Open University. But you did this work when you were at UCL?
LSE.
At LSE. Okay. Thank you so much, Ben.
And is it all going to appear magically? I hope so. Are we good? No? Do I have to? Fantastic.
1 second.
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for having me. We're in the last session of the last day, and there's still so many of you here. It's marvellous, and being at something like this really is quite extraordinary for me, so thank you very much. I am a social anthropologist. That means that you may get something a little different from me, as you tend to when social anthropologists are here. I hope that's in a good way. I'm reflecting here on one of the cruise pilot projects, the one that was entitled Flexible and Reflexive Standards, Constructing Resilient Infrastructure in Uncertainty. That was conducted by myself and also a professor at the LSE. That's Laura Bear. Laura can't be here today, but I'm going to talk you through it. And a rough order of what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to give you a real quick whistle-stop of what the project was, what we did and our findings, and then I'm going to give some quick observations about what happened next with the benefit of hindsight. And this work was 2018 into 2019. It was before the pandemic, and as you'll know, everything that happened before the pandemic, it's as if it happened to somebody else. It's actually been incredibly hard to remember everything that happened. Going back through this material has really been like seeing it afresh. So I want to just reflect on that critically at the end. So the background, what was the task? We responded to a call co-created by the Cabinet Office and the cruise leadership. And the big question, and it is a massive question I'm sure you'll appreciate, is how do you make infrastructure resilient by design? Secure and resilient by design was the phrase. This, obviously, is a very important question for protecting major investment against future threats. And so some of the questions that folded out from this, as you see, there's a really impressive list. What does secure and resilient by design in infrastructure look like? How can government be confident that at the design stage that critical national infrastructure is protected against future risks and hazards? How can you account for radical uncertainties in infrastructure? Do government departments currently think about resilience in the design of major infrastructure projects? And does security and resilience look different across different sectors? You'll appreciate, if you've got anything to do with infrastructure, these are extraordinarily large questions that we had 6 months to try and provide some kind of insight on. What we ended up doing in the fashion that anthropologists tend to do. We tried to get as close as possible to the culture of people who do this stuff, who make these decisions. So we tried to do something that approximated ethnography with the people who make decisions about infrastructure projects. So that were SROs in government departments who were in charge of new infrastructure projects. It were even our partners in the Cabinet Office became partners for this research. We talked as well to people in the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. We talked to, where we could, people in Treasury spending teams. And we tried to get as close as possible to the people who make these decisions and do what Clifford Geertz calls deep hanging out. Quite hard, actually, if you're not sort of in somebody's backyard. But you find every opportunity you can to spend time with people and try to understand things from their point of view. So we conducted a lot of interviews because that was more appropriate than participant observation for obvious reasons, with people from infrastructure projects, from government departments, from the Treasury, also some people outside in the sector. We tried to be participant observers where possible, in meetings and in Parliament and outside. We conducted some case studies when we found particular interest in particular infrastructure projects. We really deep dived into Thames Tideway, Anglian Water, and some of the things that they were doing. We had a look at HS2. We obviously consulted a lot of literature, as you would expect. This led to a report back to the Cabinet Office. It led to the circulation of that report, a workshop in the LSE, and then finally we reported some findings to the Cross-Department Security and Resilience by Design Working Group in 2018. So that's very quickly what we did, as I say, as close to ethnography as we could. And our key findings, and the full report is there on the cruise website and contains a lot more detail on all of these things, were as follows. So, for a start, resilience is not just about physical assets or even physical systems. Some of the engineers we were talking to seemed to be of the opinion that this was resilience. However, the more that we spoke to other people, the more we found out that resilience can be thought of in these other ways as well. We ended up with 5 kinds of resilience. I don't think you need to stop at 5, but we put a number on it. So we talked about physical resilience, environmental resilience, financial, political and social resilience. All frames where you can see how an infrastructure project is dependent on the things around it. Things that it should be resilient to. The second finding might sound a little obvious, but is actually really lost in lots of this discussion, which is that most infrastructure exists. Most infrastructure out there has been built and is in the maintenance phase of its life, right? And there is a real focus on new projects, new infrastructure, new builds, which doesn't take into account the fact that most infrastructure is actually out there, and that if you look across its life cycle, there's probably ways of unlooking hidden costs and benefits, but also threats to infrastructure as well. There's this real focus on new stuff, right? And we were asked to think a bit about standards for infrastructure. What could standards be? And when we talked to almost everyone, including the engineers, they said, well, standards are difficult because, you have to choose one and then there's new information. And there seemed to be a sort of growing consensus around the idea that all standards in infrastructure should be in some way reflexive, so able to look back at their decisions, and also adaptive, where possible, able to deal with new information. Easier said than done, I'm sure you agree. And we came to the conclusion that making infrastructure standards better is all about improving the quality of systems and decision making rather than necessarily providing set parameters and metrics. That's all very top level, that's all very sort of general. What we actually spent quite a lot of time doing in order to answer these questions about infrastructure was working out how an infrastructure project finds its way through government. How does it actually get built? Funnily enough, people don't seem to necessarily know that because they're situated at some point in the process. So the question of where do you get resilience into infrastructure relies on you knowing how an infrastructure project makes its way through government. It's actually really complicated. We drew this map, which, like all maps, is a very incomplete thing. There are other ways of drawing this map, many other ways of drawing it, I'm sure. But we drew this map to give a sense of how an infrastructure project makes its way through these processes of design, assurance, after it's used, and finally to decommission. I'm not going to make you sort of read this whole map. I'm not going to go through it. The main point from it is below, right? People talk about the importance of making infrastructure design and build better. How much do they actually know from their position in the process about the complicated processes that lead to that infrastructure coming into being? Okay? How much do they know about the operation of culture, power, and narrative in making an infrastructure project happen? We found that there was an awful lot going on that wasn't exactly by the book. Right. I'm going to talk about that in a second. The key recommendations we came up with, as I say, the longer version of this on the cruise website has this in a lot more detail, was that we understand that there are barriers to creating resilient standards in infrastructure across public and private sectors. We talked about quite a few of them. We came up with 8 barriers. Again, it needn't have been that number, but we mentioned 8, including the ways that they are siloed in different ways. There's a sort of univocality of experts, people in the civil service moving from department to department rather than building and maintaining knowledge about these things. We made the following key recommendations. One, that we take into account these kinds of resilience that I talked about. Try to think outside of just the physical asset and think about how an infrastructure is there embedded in different kinds of systems. Then something that we've been talking about a lot over the last couple of days, trying to adopt a system of systems approach, right? Looking at how different infrastructures interact together. There is a useful tool in the Treasury's Green Book for costing infrastructure, which is an annex which suggests a systems approach to infrastructure valuing. It is a question how much that is actually used day to day. Also, as I mentioned before, this costing that considers the entire life cycle of infrastructure, rather than just the build phase, right? In order to look at how cost decisions in infrastructure about making something more resilient will pan out over the lifetime of the infrastructure asset. And also, ideally, having flexible and reflexive standards, as I talked about before. Ideally, and this was the kind of radical solution, this was the one that we thought we'd pop out there and see if it worked at all, trying to increase the amount of expertise and the kinds of people in the room when we're looking at infrastructure standards, and possibly even using citizens' juries, getting users involved in thinking about the infrastructure around them. And then we had this idea that if you were going to intervene in an infrastructure project at any point in order to think about resilience, one of the best places to do that would be in the early strategic business case for infrastructure, the SBO, the strategic business case stage, in order to try and get resilience in-baked before it goes on to all of the other bits of the process. Now, this went rather well. We think. We certainly gave them answers, but maybe in some ways were unexpected, but also chimed with their experience. And we got some praise for it from the people we were working with in the Cabinet Office. I don't, again, expect you to read this massive, long piece of praise there, but trust me, they were quite keen, right? And then thinking about it now with the perspective of a couple of years, it made me think, well, actually, what did happen to that then? We did this piece of work. It seemed to go rather well. We came up with these answers. Is it just in a drawer somewhere? It was a question that I wanted to ask. And so this is where I get into the second bit, the critical reflection. Even as we were at that working group where we were talking about standards in infrastructure, the conversation was almost in a little bit of a box because people were already talking about Brexit, Operation Yellowhammer, Brexit preparations. And so even within the meeting itself, it was just one of many things going on. We haven't actually heard from the Cabinet Office since we did this, and we suspect that that's for very good reasons. The fact that there was Brexit, followed by COVID, followed by the people who are working with us have now probably moved on to other places, and everybody who we met in the Cabinet Office was doing a whole bunch of stuff. Right? We were working directly with somebody for whom this was one of 5 or 6 large projects on their desk. So this, for very good reasons, I think, we haven't heard very much about it since. And then, that's just one side of it. Laura and I both went to work almost immediately on other things. So our research afterwards became about COVID. Laura produced some wonderful things for Indie Sage about the effect of lockdowns. I went to work with Mark Fenton-O'Creevy at the OU, doing work about policing during the pandemic, and we moved on to the thing in front of us. And I suppose a question that we've asked a lot over the last couple of days at this conference is, how do you get around the fact that there's always something coming over the horizon that's more important to worry about? Then there's something slightly more maybe abstract, which is that as anthropologists, we give relatively complicated answers about culture. We give sort of sometimes quite confusing answers. And when we do that, when we say something like, oh, there are many kinds of resilience, or, how much do we know about the process of infrastructure design and how much of that is opaque? That might be true. People might say, oh, that makes a lot of sense. How does it suggest itself to particular and concrete action? That's why I was so interested in lots of what Kris had to say about how he actually models decision-making with people and spends time trying to make things happen. And I would say it's not clear how kind of qualitative type answers necessarily, and the kind of data that an anthropologist provides translates itself into action in government, and it's very encouraging that Carla's team has anthropologists in it, and so it must happen indeed. But I have a number of stories of anthropologists being listened to, consulted, and then the kind of findings that they have, nobody's fault at all, but those findings, because of the type that they are, not finding their way into action. So my old head of department at SOAS, he worked in infrastructure, and he would talk about being taken out, sort of almost wheeled out at these meetings of the Infrastructure and Projects Authority to say something completely from the outside, like, infrastructures, they're not things in the ground, they're socio-technical assemblages. And everybody would nod sagely, not at all, socio-technical assemblages. And then they'd almost say, sort of get him out of the room and say, right, let's crack on with what we were actually doing before then, right? And he didn't mind at all. But I do sort of worry a little bit, about that relationship potentially. How do you translate a complicated social answer into action? And so I'm going to end here with a little bit of a thought about ethnography and the value of anthropological work, something which I'm obviously rather passionate about because that's what we do. So we all know that there are systems, technologies, and processes, and we can spend a lot of time studying them and looking at them. But how much do people, when it comes to the day-to-day job that they do, actually understand and use them? An example from our work that we did was the Green Book, this long, complicated document for creating and for costing infrastructure projects, and the 5-case model. The reality we found after a while was that there's actually a much shorter version of it, a sort of a 2-page headline sheet, which is used in the day-to-day work of Treasury spending teams. Okay, so there's a lot there that can be applied in the Green Book, and it's worth looking at the Green Book, but we actually have to understand how people use it in reality, and that's a much more anthropological question. Right? We also want to. Anthropology has these tools for looking at culture, by which we include things like influence, power, status, different kinds of capital, narrative, ideas, and stories. And it's useful for looking at how these things do create decisions in government. Another example from the work that we did is this idea of ministerial push for infrastructure projects. The fact that ministers, and this was a phrase that came up more than once, like cutting big ribbons. So this must be a truism that goes around. People want to be associated with the building of particular pieces of infrastructure for reputational reasons. If everybody knows this, and actually it's quite a big motivator for certain things getting built, then it's certainly part of the package, isn't it? It's certainly part of the explanation. But do people feel a little bit guilty because it shouldn't happen like that? Is that why sometimes it's written out of accounts of decision making? What can an anthropologist say in order to make people feel comfortable about the fact that, yes, this does happen, we need to talk about it, right? And then there's this question of silos that we've all been talking about for a couple of days now. How much do teams in different bits of government know about what's happening elsewhere? I think that in some cases a lot, and in some cases rather less. So, this is, again, something that potentially anthropologists can do. Again, with the Treasury spending teams in our research, we spoke to people who are producing projects in government departments who said, well, and then they go to a Treasury spending team, and then we don't know what happens. We don't know what they're looking for. We don't actually know very much about that process. So there are certainly sort of connections and disconnections. So what I'm going to leave you with is the fact that I'm not going to come here and say that ethnography, getting down into culture, is a panacea for answering every single question. But what it can do is it can be this wonderful combination of the emic, these internal views of what's going on. People are actually quite good anthropologists of their own workplaces. You ask people how decisions are actually made and who holds the power even when they're not officially the boss, they'll tell you, right? People know this stuff, and so getting their perspective as an anthropologist is always a useful thing to do. But anthropologists don't just do that, of course. They also have an ethic or an ethics perspective where they can look across. So they can look at different perspectives within the organisation in order to bridge those understandings. And taken together, I would say these can shed light on culture, powers and norms. These things all have the capacity to create action, to make decisions, to make things happen, and to actually shape practice. And they're sometimes, because they're not particularly calculable, they're sometimes taken as a kind of ephemera. And I think that it's really a problem if we do that. So, there you go. I hope that made some kind of sense of the cruise project from a couple of years ago. And I thank you for your time. And if you want to get hold of me, please do use my email address. Thank you very much.
Before we move on to Tobias. First is, I completely agree that ethnography and anthropology have so much value to add to us understanding the things that we're kind of slightly aware of, but not able to all discuss what's going on. And when people ask me, I want to be a behavioural scientist, what shall I do? Psychology is great, but learn some ethnography, because what you gather there is stuff that's so useful to government. I apologise on behalf of the government for the churn problem. We haven't figured that one out yet. I know it keeps coming along. And in fact, that itself is a response to another problem, which is the silos. And one of the justifications for civil servants moving around is because they can start to make those connections. And why do we have silos? Because these problems are so enormous that it's really frightening to try and think outside the perspective of I'm the IPA, I'm the Treasury, I'm a private, I'm commercials, I'm working with a private sector company on something. And your systems map, those are the things I think can really endure. So that's something my team have really started to use a lot more, is systems maps, because they can get passed around. Those have decent chance of being knowledge managed well. So really wonderful stuff. And I will shut up now and hand over to Tobias Pforr, who is a research fellow at the Robert Schumann Centre for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Italy. And before that, he was a research and teaching fellow at the Universities of Reading and Warwick. And I will hand over without further ado, because we are running over, but we've got plenty of flex in the timetable, so not to worry, we will get through everything.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think you're already at the second slide. We're going to basically move on. So we had the first two cruise pilot projects, which worked with the Cabinet Office. And now we're going to move to the next two projects, which worked in the humanitarian sector. And we both worked with an organization called the START Network, Erica and I, but we came at it from very different angles. So you get kind of two perspectives on it. Now, I think it's a little bit important just to give you some explanation of what the START Fund and the START Network is, so you can better understand what I actually did. So the START Fund was basically funded through grants, first from DFID and the German Federal Office, and then IKEA Foundation and private donors, to allow small to medium-sized crises to be tackled by humanitarian organizations. So the START Fund is basically owned by its members. It's about 50 to 60 humanitarian organizations, and they can apply to this fund to get additional money to tackle all sorts of crises all around the world. Now here you can see what by now is, I'm sure, an out-of-date map of all the START network members. And the way their processes work is any of these organizations can raise what's called an alert. And it means basically there's something going on somewhere around the world where one of these organizations would like to intervene. So say there's a flood in Mozambique, and so they can ask, we would like to raise £200,000 from this fund to make a humanitarian intervention to help the people who've been hit by this flood. And then there's a committee composed by members who were elected and chosen from all these member organizations who review these alerts and who decide whether this is something where the network should intervene. And that was the project and where they're working. And obviously there's loads of uncertainties already there, right? What kind of events should they focus on? What information should they require? What kind of crises should they do? Now, to make matters more complicated, something that had started to be done in the humanitarian and development sector was something called anticipatory action. And that was the idea. The old model of humanitarian work was there was a disaster, then you film the disaster, you put it on television, you ask people to donate, you take that money, you give it to local partners, and then these partners can provide relief. And obviously that's a slow process. So you're always behind the disaster. You can only ever act after the disaster has already occurred. So the idea was, why can't we pre-commit some financing? We know disasters will occur. So anticipatory action is essentially the attempt that why don't we have some pre-committed financial resources which we can give to humanitarian organizations and NGOs, which then can pre-position goods, prepare plans already before a disaster occurs, that then after the disaster occurs, they're immediately ready to act. Now, that obviously sounds great, right? And it certainly has many advantages, but one of the disadvantages is that exposes these companies to great reputational risks, right? Because you might be preparing for a drought, so you buy loads of water, you ship it to a particular region, and then it starts to rain and you actually have no need for your water. And that was something these companies were very worried about. So they approached David and were like, is there somebody we can work with who can help us manage these uncertainties? So I basically came in and I worked with the START network and different START fund members for a period of about 6 months in 2018. And I tried to help them both emotionally and organizationally cope with uncertainty. Now there's a lot of stuff we did, and I'll only be able to give you a glimpse of what we did, but we can come to any other questions you have in the Q&A. Now, yesterday we heard about that uncertainty is a wicked problem, and I think if any organization faces a wicked problem, it is the START network. And it's basically just to say that the problems that the START network faces are very unlike roulette, where you can calculate your advantages of winning and losing, right? The problems are so wide-ranging, right? So the START network will intervene in possible election violence, floods, droughts, migration, livestock losses. And they really have no formal models of decision-making. Sometimes they don't even have very few formal models of the natural hazard they're trying to things, and they're under enormous time pressure. So the START network has given itself the goal of 2 days or after an alert has been raised, they want to pay out the funds. So they have very, very little time. And the committee might have to deal with all sorts of natural and social disasters as a very short time period. So you can see here that's really a situation where you have enormous uncertainties under enormous time pressures, and there's real consequences if help doesn't arrive. Another thing, particularly listening to the conversations yesterday, which I encountered when I started working here, they were enormously scared of biases. So clearly they had read some of the behavioral science literature, and they were like, yes, we want to intervene, but we are very worried that we are biased in certain ways, and how can we not be biased in our decision-making? So one of the first things I actually had to do with them is sort of to relieve them of their fear of their biases, right? And the fact that in a situation where you have limited information, limited time, limited computational resources, biases are efficient, right? Biases are actually the way to go because through experience, they can actually lead you to good outcomes in limited time. And then the other thing you had to teach them is that their work was supposed to be biased in certain ways, right? They had the aim of helping the most vulnerable. They had the aim of focusing on limited crises. So it was telling them that actually in their very work, they were biased towards certain kind of crises, and it was these biases, in some sense, that they were supposed to cultivate and be aware of them. And it sort of took a lot of conversations with them that they sort of started being more comfortable with this. Now, in a wicked world, right, we've heard many times, right, we heard pluralism is the way to go, and I'm also a big supporter of that, right? So you want to have, for different problems, you want to see what kind of models, what kind of frameworks can I bring to bear that will help me resolve the problem as I face it in the real world. So I'm not going to go through this table, but there's basically different kind of models with different kind of ways of approaching risk and uncertainty, particularly if they're rule-based or not, if we're talking about individual decisions or social, if optimality exists, and what the basis of the decision is. And so I try to work with them through all sorts of decision processes and kind of give them a sense for what my feeling is in what situation, what decision process would be most appropriate. Now, just to give you a sense of all the various things we did, so one of the things, they were very good with is that they recorded all of their meetings and decisions on when and whether they allocate money for a particular crisis. So it was basically possible for me to listen to all of these transcripts and recordings and then work with them and ask them, why did you decide this way? Why did you decide that in particular ways? So that's one of the first things I did, and then obviously had loads of conversation with the management team, with the different people at the network, to understand the dynamics. Another thing we did together with David is we actually once or twice did some trainings on uncertainty and Delphi-inspired simulations on a particular alert, and we sort of just showed them. And one of the things you saw is, because there's so much uncertainty, rather than trying to solve the problem they're faced with, people in a room will kind of decide who do they think is the most knowledgeable on the subject matter, and then basically defer the decision to them and go along with whatever they say. So even though you might think, well, we're making a group decision of 10 experts, you actually only have maybe 1 or 2 experts who everybody else defers to, and that's one of the things that really came powerfully out in these sessions. Another thing, and I'm going to go into this, I did sort of some guidance note and I changed some of the templates, and that's one of the things I'm going to talk about in just a little more detail. But before doing so, I just want to note that in the work of START, right, there is some irresolvable tensions that you'll always have to tackle and you always have to deal with, right? So there's the problem of time frame versus quality, right? Obviously, given infinite amount of time, you could make probably each of these decisions much better, but you don't have infinite amount of time. So there will always be a trade-off, how much time you spend on this and the quality of the decision you have. Then there's always the question of trust versus control, right? So the START network is an umbrella organization, so it can either try to control all of its members or it can trust them to the right thing. So the question is, how much should it try to control and check on what their members were doing with the money? The same sort of, you have humanitarian, there's the humanitarian work, and then you have the representative of agencies who sometimes may just want to get more money for the agency rather than actually do humanitarian work. And then you have the idea, are we going to try to get local delivery of products, or are we going to, buy products in the UK and ship them to where they are needed? That may often be faster and maybe even easier because you have existing contexts, but you don't help to develop local networks. The last 2 things, 3 points, I'm just going to skip because I'm already very low. Now, one thing I really we spend a lot of time on, and I want to talk about, right, is this problem of organizational templates. Because, they're humanitarian organizations, and they had a feeling, we have to be able to justify everything we do with data. The problem was, for most of the decisions they were doing, there wasn't any data. The data just didn't exist, and if it existed, they didn't have it, right? And one of the things I found in many of their processes is that they had set up the entire process in a way where members were required to submit data that they couldn't possibly know, and so they just made it up, right? So you could see these alert notes where people said, the number affected by this disaster, 518,787. And you ask them, how did you calculate this? And they're like, oh, I don't know. And then obviously nobody knew how this number was calculated, but you knew, and this could be wrong by a factor of 5 or 10, but somebody just, wrote down some numbers so it looks good. So one of the things I sort of started doing with them is rather than focusing sort of on single point estimates, at least do ranges, sort of to give sort of a level of confidence you have, right? So maybe it's between 50,000 and 300,000 people. And I also tried to work with them more that rather than pretending they knew exactly what they were going to do, particularly if a disaster hadn't occurred yet, to move them to think about contingency, right? So if the disaster unfolds in this way, this is what we're going to do. If the disaster unfolds in a slightly different way, that's what we're going to do. And I tried to sort of really get it across, right? If they pre-plan in a particular way that then doesn't occur, that might have more negative consequences than no planning at all, right? Because the resources might simply be in the wrong place, it might be the wrong resources. So there's this one anecdote from a different but related project where it was with another humanitarian organizations, and they sort of tried to do this, and they just ended up buying shovels after a flood and giving it to the farmers and be like, here, this is humanitarian aid. And the farmer said, we don't need shovels, we have shovels, why are you giving us shovels? But they just, thought, anything will do. So this is sort of a graphical thing. What we sort of then did for the organization, we sort of produced these internal guidance notes for decision makers, and sort of everybody on the committee was given these guidance notes. And at the beginning, sort of I did some trainings for them. And the one thing I really wanted them to also take away, that learning is key to uncertainty, right? If you just have a pure problem that you can solve via some kind of calculation, you don't need to learn. But if you have uncertainty, you need to learn. And one of the tensions, again, that was faced with START is that, right, learning and review in some sense is an overhead. And all of these organizations are always encouraged to have as little overhead as possible. But I sort of tried to promote them that if they want to improve their decision-making processes, they have to have a formal process of review and evaluation. They have to have, after an alert has been raised, after humanitarian assistance has been given, there has to have some review of what was done well, and what was done badly. And the important thing is also honesty, right? That people wouldn't, in retrospect, be punished for things that didn't go well, right? That you had to inculcate a sort of a recursive learning process. And I was also, part of it, right, was that it wasn't so much about, in the first instance, not a question of rules and exact procedures, but sort of the right mindset and ethos, right? How do emotionally, you have to accept uncertainty and not try to shove it to the side. And you have to be aware that this uncertainty is irresolvable. There's no expert, not even Erica, who can get away all of the uncertainty and tell you the right answer. And the idea is that you then, through learning with uncertainty and through dealing with, you try to develop good intuitions, right, which then will allow you to use heuristics to make the right decisions. And that they're also aware, sort of the other side of the coin, that uncertainty has real emotional costs, both for the organization and for the individuals, right? And that always worrying about reputational risk can also be a danger. I mean, Gerd Gigerenzer, his defensive decision-making is sort of an illustration of this, as that if you're only worried about what can happen to your organization if things go wrong, it can be paralyzing for the organization, and that you sort of have to tackle this in your internal culture. Now, maybe as sort of a final reflection, and this is very much to be taken with a grain of salt, right, is what academia can do and what it can't do, right? So I think academia, because we can come in as sort of from the outside, we can help an organization clarify its own goals, right? And we can sort of help them get sort of some confidence that nobody can give them the single answer that will be the solution to all of their problems. And we can also sort of, by talking with them and by telling them from what things look like from the academy, you can sort of give them conviction to find action, right? That they actually know, no, there isn't another expert who would have done it perfectly. It just sort of doesn't exist. But conversely, right, as a social scientist, being in these situations and seeing the uncertainty they have to deal with is also a very good antidote for very naive optimization model research, right? Where you just assume perfect information, no transaction costs, and you can provide an optimal solution to these very, very wicked problems. But as a panacea, right, the one thing we can't do is we can't provide these solutions, right? So that one of the hopes you always encountered was that, you know, an academic would come in and we can just tell them what to do. But it's their organization, right, that you can help them clarify what they want to do, but they do. And also this idea that there is one solution to every problem, it just doesn't exist, right? And another important part to that is you shouldn't start redoing everything from scratch. You have to take the organization as you find it and try to lead them along to a change. And you can't just pretend like you're starting ex nihilo. Maybe 2 last points, right? Don't just apply a pre-existing framework like neoclassical economics and you just solve it out. Be like, well, it should work. Why doesn't it work? I don't know. It works on paper. And I think maybe I'll leave it here because I've run way over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tobias. And it's so lovely to hear a piece of academic work on decision-making that sounds like it reflects the kind of messiness and complexity, and you don't know how much you don't know that goes on inside government and big decision-making contexts. And that sense of helping people to know what it is that they don't, what they could know, how to get it, then stop, then work with the uncertainty. That itself is a collection of skills that I think probably emerge in policymaking, but could be made more explicit. And it also shows why the temptation to go for quantification is so overwhelming, because it actually provides some relief from all of that. You know something, or at least you think you know something, and you know who proposed that something. So we will move on to our fourth speaker, who will tell us how to properly use data science in a decision-making context. So Erica Thompson is a Senior Policy Fellow of the Ethics of Modelling and Simulation at LSE's Data Science Institute, and she's funded by a UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship, and she's going to be talking about her work with START for Kris.
Thank you. Thanks, Carla. And, you know, I haven't got too many slides, so I'll try to keep to time. So I will echo a few of the points that I think other people have already made today, and I'll also try to hark back a bit to yesterday, because yesterday perhaps we were talking more about the quantitative aspects of decision-making. My background is in physics and mathematics, and so I come to this from the point of view of someone who would like to try to make models, like Trevor, but also understands that there are these limitations on the use of models. There is radical uncertainty. We have to deal with it, and we have to make decisions anyway. We can't just duck out. So I'll present a few practical tips based on my experiences with this project. Now, the project that I did whenever it was, 5 years ago, I guess now, with the cruise network was about heatwave in Pakistan. But on the note of continuity that we've already raised, actually this project perhaps is unique in that it did have some degree of continuity. I'm still at LSE. I've moved from Lenny's group into the Data Science Institute. And the people that were there at the START network when I was working with them on that project on heatwave in Pakistan and facilitating that decision-making in advance of a crisis were still there, and they asked me to come back and do some more work directly funded on cyclone in Madagascar. So I thought I would talk about that today. And I'll just go through a few brief principles. The first one being that when we come to a problem, and as Tobias has just said so nicely, you know, we must not jump in as academics and enforce our own question onto someone who has a practical real-world problem that already exists and has an idea of what they're doing. We need not to come in and say, aha, The problem is to forecast where this cyclone is going to make landfall. That is not the problem. The question that they were interested in is how do we reduce the humanitarian impact of cyclones in Madagascar? And that is a different question from how do we predict cyclones in Madagascar. But the good news is that we have got models. We've got great weather models which are pretty good at forecasting cyclones in the Southwest Indian Ocean, and they can't tell you exactly what's going to happen. They can't tell you exactly when and where it's going to make landfall, or how big it will be, or how much rainfall there will be when it does make landfall. But a few days in advance, you probably do have some information. So if we have this model and we want to use this model, the benefits of model success from the START network's point of view is the ability to be able to go in there maybe 2 days in advance, maybe if you're lucky 3 or 4 days in advance, and either get people out of the area or get them prepared, for, disseminate warnings, disseminate infrastructure, board up buildings, help, there are these obvious things which people in these areas already know what to do, and the facilitation is kind of helping the information and the equipment to get through to the right places at the right time. So the benefit of model success is the ability to reduce the damage and the destruction. Now, the possible consequences of model failure, on the flip side, there is, the fact that the damage, destruction is likely to happen anyway. There will be some residual that you cannot mitigate, and that if you do things in the wrong way, you might make things even worse. And if you're the START network, there might be some reputational damage as well. If you start going in and doing the wrong things in the wrong place, if you evacuate the wrong town, there are going to be consequences of doing that. So I'll talk about this tropical cyclone which hit Madagascar in February this year, very recently. Now, our second principle for escaping from model land and making decisions informed by models that are genuinely useful in the real world is to plan those escape routes from model land. So I've shown here a few forecasts of this tropical cyclone. Now, you can see that actually this one was a very well-behaved one, and a good week in advance of the event, there was strong information coming through from the weather forecast models saying it is pretty likely that this cyclone is going to hit Madagascar, it's going to be a pretty big one. So they were able to start taking kind of preparatory internal action a long way in advance, saying, oh dear, it's coming, we're going to have to start thinking about this. But the work that I'd been doing with them in advance of this, before the cyclone season, was to think about how their sort of operational procedures would integrate that information. So we'd looked at the quality of these models with respect to the previous data, and said that there is, in many cases, there is some information a long way in advance. This one, it turns out, if you look at the available data, is very cherry-picked. It's quite a big one, it's quite a well-behaved one, and there was a good 7 days of warning, but in the main, you don't get anywhere near that much. And so you probably want to be quite cautious about trying to make decisions a long way in advance, even though that would help you to, conduct more effective action if you had that reliable information. So the procedure that they set up was to attempt to activate the alert approximately 3 days in advance. Now, one of the strengths of the START network's approach relative to some other anticipatory action approaches is the flexibility, the way that it is part of a deliberative process. It's not a strict quantitative trigger. And so they were able to take this model information and, within the framework of that sort of operational procedure, look at whether it was sort of landing on one side or the other, whether it would be slightly more reliable than usual or slightly less, and take that all into account as contextual information. And the operational constraints, they were able not just to look at the model and say, how far in advance do we expect to predict cyclones and what can we do with that information? They could also say, well, given that we are only able to predict cyclones 3 days in advance, and we're going to be doing a lot of running around on the ground to try and get ready for it if that's the case, because we want to be able to get in, do all these activities, and get out again before the cyclone arrives. What can we do to our operations? Now, normally, as Tobias described, it takes quite a long time. It's sort of, there's a procedure for writing and submitting an alert, then there's a meeting, then the funding gets allocated, then there's a further round of projects being proposed and another meeting to decide which projects to fund. And so that takes, days, right? And you've used up all of the time that you had available. So what they've said was, well, actually, what could we do to improve the utility of the information from this model? We can change our operational procedures. We can do that much quicker if we have pre-selected projects, things that people are going to do on the ground, and we just have to have a meeting as quickly as possible, activate it, and go. And so they did that. So they've been trialling this process with Cyclone in Madagascar. That is not the process for all of the other anticipatory alerts, because they have a different procedure for that, and there are time zone issues and coordination issues with doing it faster. But for Cyclone, they did it faster on the basis that that was what the information was that was available and what it needed in order to be able to make use of it. But beyond that, of course, there are limits. There are going to be fundamental limits to the usefulness of this information. This cyclone happened to be particularly predictable. Many of them are not. Many of them kind of come up out of nowhere, and instead of having a nice sort of straight line, you have a spaghetti plot that goes absolutely everywhere, and you really don't have any idea what's going to happen. And so you can do some degree of warning and preparation, but it wouldn't make sense to alert, every region of Madagascar for something that will probably only, have some impact in a particular area. And the other area where we can look at the utility of information and match it to operational procedures was looking at the predictability, for example. Rather than looking at wind speed, look at the predictability of rainfall. Now, the rainfall from a cyclone will be spread out over a much wider area, and therefore is kind of inherently more predictable in the round than the maximum wind speeds at the point of landfall, because that depends on exactly where it goes, whereas the rainfall is distributed over a much wider area. And so focusing, for example, anticipatory action on those impacts and damages that are associated with high levels of rainfall and flooding is more effective and less uncertain than focusing on the point of landfall and the damage due to high wind speeds. So thinking more widely than that, this was a pilot project, again, sort of a pilot and then another pilot, and the ambition of the START network, looking wider, is to turn this into a larger disaster risk financing scheme. Now, I think when we escape from model land, it's important to bear in mind that we are not our model is not on its own. We are part of an ecosystem of other models, other systems, the real world, all of the decision-making that happens there. And that when we are making sort of future-oriented arrangements, especially financial arrangements, these rely on expectations which are supported by model-derived information. And so, it is not only our model, it will also be the models of many other people interacting with ours, and our own sort of choices about how we deal with our model that are going to be important in the actual real-world impact of this system. And as we've seen from situations like the global financial crisis in 2008, the model inadequacies that we discover are likely to have cascading consequences. They do not confine themselves to the box that you've drawn around your system. They can go elsewhere. And so it's not enough just to make your own domain model-proof. In the real world, you have to also look out to what others are doing and help them to escape from model land in the same way, so that you can increase that resilience and robustness by, in the round. And so my last slide is that we must embrace that radical uncertainty of the real world, because it is not solely a risk, it is also an opportunity. In the past, in the non-stationary environment, like a changing climate or a financial system which is evolving in an unknown way, the past data, they are not simply an inaccurate guide to the future that we can use to estimate the future with some error bars around it. They cannot possibly, as we've already seen, contain the radical uncertainty of possible future events. And, as somebody mentioned this morning, those theories and models that we train on past data also can't contain that uncertainty. So we might think about things like this hurricane that recently hit Nova Scotia. We might think about the challenges of predicting the evolution of the pandemic or other pandemics that might happen in the future. We might look at the gyrations in the financial markets recently following the announcements from the Chancellor. And on those, perhaps you might say, well, is it the case that subjective expectations or some kind of information market could contain this radical uncertainty about the future more effectively than the theories and models that we have or that the previous data we have can? And, I think they could. It's possible. They certainly can contain more of it, but they cannot, again, contain all of it, and they won't necessarily do so. So we are always going to be left with that radical uncertainty. And perhaps my final message to leave you with is the reflexivity question that's already been raised, that models don't just represent or predict the world, they also feed back into changing it. And therefore, I think if we go beyond that, we can say that the kinds of models that we choose to build are shaping the kind of future that we're going to end up living in. And so I think that it's not just a question of trying to find the best model for this particular type of question. It's also trying to find a model that accords with the values and principles, democratic principles perhaps, of the way that we want to live in the future, in whatever environment we're trying to predict, so that we can shape a future that is interesting, exciting, and ultimately a nice place to live in. So I'll leave you with my book, which unfortunately has not yet been translated into as many languages as anybody else's book, but there is that to come. There is radical uncertainty about the number of languages it will be translated into. But do get in touch if you'd like to talk about any more of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. That was wonderful. And there are 2 points that struck me from your talk is the importance of the perspective taking, of getting modelers to care about things they're not used to caring about in terms of the operational procedures and the detail of other people's lives. And the same for the operational people, to understand the detail of what's actually in the models and what the data is that you can provide. And that kind of perspective taking and learning to expand what you care about is crucial to coordinated action. And another is the importance of trade-offs. So you can know stuff in advance, but if you take the wrong action, it has a cost. And I certainly recognise the trade-off today in letting speakers run a little longer than originally planned, but I thought it was well worth it in order to get those fantastic insights. So in the last 3 minutes before I let you all go for coffee, I thought I'd share just a couple of cross-cutting themes that have struck me both today, but also in conversations that I've had with the panel and my own team before today. And the first of those is co-production. How do we get those processes by which we bring people together, whether those are existing communities, whether those are communities that we create, in order to share responsibility for and make the best decisions. The second is bringing a frame to the decisions and the problems that emphasises a bit more about the system, the context within which people operate, rather than what's inside people's heads when they're responding to that system, and that shining a light on that, whether it's through systems maps or other techniques, can really help to make progress. And then the third, which is something that came up in my team thinking about this last week, is that the data forecasting is a way of trying to tame the future and to see what the future might hold. But there are other approaches that can help tame the future, whether it is using sort of simulation techniques, but also in my team we find design thinking is a way of imagining the future and taking action in the context of the future with iterative feedback loops about, okay, what are the user needs we're trying to meet? How are we meeting them? Let's find out, let's try something and then iterate, and what needs to change about a decision-making context to make it more amenable to that sort of information in the way that it has become amenable to the quantitative information, and we need to have both. So I will let you all go for coffee and give you folks a break online, and we will come back together again at 3 o'clock for 1 more hour, and that is when please hold your questions, develop them with colleagues over coffee, and really come back thinking about, well, what are the questions we need to answer, the problems we need to solve, the ideas and the principles that will help us to take action to make better decisions and help make the world a better place from the basis of everything we've heard today. Back at 3 o'clock, please. Otherwise, I'll come and chase you. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope you're all refreshed and have been getting into good conversations over the break. Welcome back, everybody, online. So as I sort of trailed before the break, this is obviously a discussion of what we've just heard, but also it can be broadened out to anything that would feed into that sort of crucial question of what we're going to do, what we're going to do differently, how we're going to make that action happen. And just to make sure that we are taking account of the thoughts that people have been sharing online, could we get is there folks with microphones? Okay, so Kaylee in the front row. So Kaylee is my question meister and has been picking out, I think you're going to paraphrase, aren't you, some of the questions?
Yeah, so there's an interesting question come through online about how do we know if we're making effective decisions in the absence of models of what an effective decision looks like? Are we making assumptions about the effectiveness of decisions within organisations? What do we judge that on? What do we base effective decision making on in the absence of models?
Great, thank you so much. Does anybody particularly want to take that one? Do you want to go for it, Tobias?
I mean, I think there's sort of two ways of going that, right? I mean, the most obvious thing would be to say outcomes, right? So outcomes are a good feedback of what you're trying to do. But I think even more important is process, right? So no matter what the outcome is, and maybe things didn't work out, and you look at it retrospectively and said, would you have done something different in the process? You know, could you have done something different? And if you're looking back, even if you tried to make a decision and it didn't work out in your favor, and you say, you know what, I really did everything right, sort of I tried to take everything into account and it just didn't work out, and I actually wouldn't want to make any changes to the process, I think that's a good point. Now, you can probably always make small tweaks to any process. So I think it's sort of that feedback loop, but I think generally, you know, think about the process of decision making and would you change something major? And if the answer is no, then I think or nothing major, then I think you're pretty close.
That's great. Any other thoughts on that?
I have a couple. So it's there are actually lots of principles of good decision making that have come out of solid research over decades in different branches of psychology and business and organizational management and whatever field they exist in. And these principles sit in books that sit on people's shelves, and they don't always make it into reality. And giving people the practice to bring them into reality is one thing that you can do. And some of our scenarios that I talked about are precisely that experiential, immersive way of getting people to understand how they can make better decisions. David mentioned one that I would recommend every organization to take, which is invite dissent into your decision-making process. Make it explicit that some people will need to be the voice of dissent to question the groupthink that is starting to emerge. Another way, which I think Tobias hinted at, is the post-mortem. Like once you've made your decision, go back over your process of decision-making and make sure that you didn't drop anything. Another one that we build in one of those scenarios is like the way that you scaffold the decision by not putting a big question on the table, but breaking it down into many small questions and answering them one after the other with a good process. Those are all things that people have shown to be ways of making better decisions, of leading to higher quality decisions in the long term.
Brilliant, thank you. Anything you have?
And then I think, you know, once you've done that, assuming that you are sort of satisfied that you have a good process, then you just have to accept that you don't experience all of the possible worlds and all of the possible outcomes. You're going to be left with one, and it might be a good one and it might be a bad one. And you can go back and change the process for sure, but you know, you can't change the decision that was made. You can only attempt to do better next time.
Yeah, that's really great. I don't feel like you have to. I'm not going to go
I will. My slightly sideways spin on answering the question would be, I don't use models and I'm from a discipline that doesn't use models. And so my question would be, how much and how are the models actually used? If a decision is being made and somebody says that there's a model in the room, are they basing the decision on the model? They may well be. That is interesting. Or are they not? Are they defaulting to something else? Are there other relationships of power, power influence, the thing that was done before, actually in the room at play? So maybe sometimes a focus or an over-focus on the models at use can be a kind of red herring.
Okay, so it might oblige you to the other factors. Really helpful. Okay, so we're getting some questions right behind. Trevor, right at the back.
Thank you very much. Excellent talks today, thank you. Someone mentioned reputation management, and I was thinking, to what extent do the media impede good decision-making under radical uncertainty? And do we need a better definition of what a mistake is?
Well, I like that very much. Is there anyone else who wants to ask? Let's go to John. And then the lady in the front. And the guys can be thinking about the answers. John.
Carl, I just wanted to say how much I disagree with the statement that you judge decisions by looking at the process and the outcome. The majority of decisions that have been really important and changed the world have been made by bad process. The reason bureaucratic organizations in the private sector and bureaucratic organizations in the public sector find it, make loads of bad decisions, and certainly the reason they're not innovative is that they judge the quality of a decision by the process that goes into it. The kind of decisions Henry Ford and Steve Jobs made were not good decisions judged by process. And to judge them by outcome takes one into what Annie Duke, who's a very successful woman poker player, called resulting, which is you judge decisions by what the outcome is. If you put your number, if you buy a winning lottery ticket, that was a good decision to buy the ticket. It wasn't. We need to, it's much more difficult to work out what is a good decision. And the decisions that have really been important to society and the economy are mostly things that would certainly have been judged as bad decisions by the criteria of process, and were the ones that worked out well out of many similar decisions that worked out badly. You know, Henry Ford's Model T was a great success, but the vast majority of people who made cars in the period when Ford was making them Model T went bust or didn't succeed with remotely the scale he did. It's much more complicated, and we need to acknowledge that in the face of radical uncertainty, it isn't a matter of process and outcome.
So I don't entirely disagree with you, John, but I think there must be a selection bias there. You know, you're picking examples from the past where bad processes were used, but almost all decisions in the past were made by bad processes. It's not surprising that a few of them turned out well.
I also,
Go ahead.
Yeah, and
let's
also,
do this question first. Yeah.
So I also empathize with that view, right? So the lone genius who just really figures this out. But I just think can deeply lead us astray. I think most decisions aren't like Henry Ford figuring out we don't want faster horses but cars, right? Or Steve Jobs deciding, no, actually we do want tablets, even though all market research had shown we don't want tablets. So I think that for most organizational decisions, I think that's not the right frame and picture to use. But I appreciate that there may be select decisions where that's completely right.
I mean, of course there's selection bias, but that's the problem we're confronting and unable to answer.
Really interesting.
So I think that then we might as well go home, right? If there is nothing to be learned about making better decisions, then why are we here? And so I do disagree with what you say in the sense that, yes, outcome isn't necessarily the thing that we need to use to decide how to make decisions, but thinking that the way we did it in the past is the only way that we have available is a kind of stasis argument that means that we can't, that you're saying we can't improve on how we did things in the past. And I think we are here talking about problems that are orders of magnitude bigger than the problems we dealt with in the 20th century. And they will need a different way of making decisions than the haphazard gut feeling based way that people did it in the 20th century, that the lone genius did work it out. It is now much more about collaboration, about putting different minds together rather than having one person come up with the right decision. And that process of putting different minds together, that is what needs good process. And that is what can be studied to make sure that you don't make it a chance occurrence, that you increase it a little bit. Even if it's a tiny bit, you can hopefully increase the rate at which we are making relatively good decisions.
Ben, do you want to
There's nothing I said that made you think that I thought we'd been making decisions really well in the past.
I don't think anyone's under that misapprehension.
This is a genuine question from a position of ignorance and rather than anything else. But we're now throwing around the word good process, bad process. What actually, and this is a genuine question, what do we mean? Sorry, as I say, not a deep comment, genuine question from a position of ignorance.
No, I think, working out what those different sort of, what processes could be and what kind of little outcomes they tend to lead to, and which, in a democratic organisation, you've got to have accountability, so you've got to have some kind of process, but how you reconcile that to that a lot of the steps forward that we've made have not been by those processes is something to still be worked through. Right, let's do Trevor's question next. So that is the reputation management question and how far the media are inhibiting, perhaps affecting ability to make good decisions under radical uncertainty, and whether we need to rebrand, give a fresh look to the word mistake. And I know that's something our team does, is say mistakes are a really useful natural resource. So anybody go for it?
Yeah, I mean, on the mistake side, I'm maybe skipping the question about the media. One of the sort of difficult conversations that we had with the START network was around understanding what to do in the event that things went wrong. And I mean, getting things wrong is a consequence of uncertainty, right? But the uncertainty is also an opportunity. So by acting further in advance, you gain more opportunity to act before the event happens, but you lose by dint of having more uncertainty and therefore running greater risk of it going wrong. And at some point you have a red line which says, I have to have this much lead time, but I can't have more than this amount of uncertainty. And either they kind of overlap or they don't. And so in that context, you know, a mistake, a decision that turned out to be a bad decision because of the happenstance of events, they will happen with whatever probability you decide you're willing to accept. If you say we are willing to accept a 5% chance of it going wrong, then if your procedures are correct, you get exactly 5%. If your procedures are perfect, you get exactly 5%. If your procedures were wrong, you might get 0. If your procedures were wrong, you might get 10%. That would be a mistake. But the fact of doing the wrong thing on 5% of occasions itself is not a mistake. And you're right that reframing what we mean in order to by a mistake or a poor outcome and accepting that some poor outcomes happen as a consequence of making better decisions overall, that is a really important part of the communication of setting these sort of systems up, and something that is difficult because you don't just have a cost and benefit associated with the decision itself. You then also have all these things about reputation, and then it comes to your question about media, which I'm probably going to skip and let somebody else talk about.
Great. Okay. So
Can I pick up on the media?
yeah, go for it. Let's do it.
It's one of the things that we do is train journalists in telling different stories about the big problems that we are dealing with. And the reason for doing that is that every professional and every sector has a set of practices, a tool set that they are reaching for when they are dealing with a specific manifestation of a problem. And for journalists at this moment, their tool set is to reach for the way that they're talking about mistakes in the way that you would like to see change, Trevor. And so if you want a journalist to be able to tell different stories, then just a redefinition of the word mistake alone isn't going to be enough. You need to help the journalists to understand how they can tell different stories about the struggles that we are dealing with at the moment. So, and that's the kind of work that needs to happen in addition to improving the stuff within the organizational structure of the decision-making organizations.
No, I really like. Does anybody else want to pick up on media?
Sure, maybe I just say, Trevor, it's a really great question. I would agree with everything that Erica has said. Maybe an additional spin, right, is this, you do want some accountability, right? So the media has an important role. So if there was no accountability, if there was no reporting on what they were doing, they may not have as much of an incentive to improve their processes and try to minimize their mistakes. Having said that, there is probably such a thing as too much accountability, right? Where legitimate things not working out can be construed as mistakes. And I think, probably if you ask Carla, right, maybe the government often is so scared that, things might get out into the public, some journalist picks up on something, that they wouldn't even embark on processes where things might go wrong or seem risky. So as with everything, right, there's a trade-off and a balance to be had.
Yeah, it's a conversation. Yes, go ahead.
And maybe equally that you never know what the counterfactual is. It's easy to imagine a sort of rosy alternative scenario where everything worked out really well somehow, but I think often that's wishful thinking as well.
Yeah, really great points. So this lady has been, it's a cat. Sorry, now my eyes have come into focus, I see it's a cat.
This lady's happy, don't worry. So it's a small point really, but I'm surprised we haven't talked about it at all, so it's mostly curiosity. What about images? So we talked about narratives, obviously, we talked about uncertainty, we talked about how we communicate, how we take individual, collective decision makings and the various strategies that might hurt, but images, at least in my field, they have unique roles, they summarize information. Example, you talked about modeling, yes, but usually policymakers understand an image you present to them of the model. Who chooses that image? What's on the image? How many dimensions? Does it matter?
That's really great. And actually, did somebody... Lucy definitely had her hand up at the back, and then we'll take these two. So I'm going to take them in pairs so I don't forget the two questions, but we give the panel a chance to think. Go for it.
Lucy Kimball, University of the Arts, London. So I work in design, which is absolutely about images as well as narrative. And I'd like to hear from the panelists about what conditions and what organisational capabilities do they think are required to enable effective translations of evidence and models into change impacts. So not just decisions, but actual changes. So the translation work, the conditions and the organisational capabilities required.
Oh, I love that. Okay, so feel free to pick either of those to start with.
I mean, it may be a rather obvious point, but absolutely. Images, maps, things that have been produced in order to show relationships in that way are obviously a lot more effective at communicating quickly things that it may take a large number of words to do. And there is an associated risk with that as well, of course, that people then hold on to very tightly the image produced, the neat map that you've produced to show them about their question. And so I think that you use them as a double-edged sword in a way. I think that you have to use them to communicate and constantly stress the fact that they don't describe the world as it actually is. But that is just my take on it.
Any other thoughts on images?
I have one. So obviously in those tablet-based scenarios, there are a lot of images there. There is a lot of visual content there. But some of the things that we discovered in some of the co-production work that we did, or not discovered because it's been known for a long time, but actively tested with policymakers, is that the image alone doesn't tell the whole story. So we did that in a sort of risk message testing workshops with briefing officials of heads of government, where we showed them graphs of projections of what was going to happen to climate change in the next 30 years, so not long in the future, but relatively close in the future. And then we asked them, we presented them the images without doing a lot of storytelling around them, and we asked those officials, what does this tell you? And they said they're just lines going up on the page. They don't mean anything to me. So then we did storytelling around that. We told the stories, we linked the stuff that they were seeing on the graphs to stuff that they already had experience of. And then it started to work. So it's narrative that links to lived experience together with image has a large effect. But image by itself is not a panacea. So.
That's great. Well, feel free to chip in on images as well. Otherwise, anybody wants to pick up Lucy's question on organisational capabilities for not only decision-making, but for translation and making of change and impact.
Yeah, I can have a go at that.
Go for it.
I mean, just from sort of personal observation, I suppose, and I'm sure that there are other factors involved, but ones that I see to be important are continuity of personal relationships. So if the evidence is coming from outside an organisation, you know, that point of interface tends to be one person, two people, and as we've already seen today, if they move away, then you just lose that completely and it's gone, and that it's really difficult to get back into that space. And those personal relationships need to encompass a sort of shared narrative about what it is that you're trying to achieve, so that you have aligned incentives in terms of actually solving the same problem and not trying to solve two completely different problems, or being willing to meet in the middle.
And maybe to sort of expand it on for me, a sort of higher level of abstraction, right? I mean, for me, this is really a question of ethos, of mindset, right? That you realize because the world is radically uncertain, mistakes will be made. And so you have to have accountability without immediate blame, and sort of have to be willing to learn and improve and realize that there's never an end, there are an end point, but the end point can never be reached. So it's about continuous improvement and continuous change. And I think those are to me, some central points that enable organizations of all types to change.
So having incentive structures that are about supporting continuous improvement feedback loops. Got it.
Yes, so with the Climate Action Unit, we do a lot of co-production work and sort of end-user engagement. And one of the things that we're always trying to do is to bring in a good process to help the people in the organizations to be ready to be engaging with an academic expert who comes with academic expertise. And one of the things that we're always running into everywhere is a big gap between wants and needs. So when you ask a decision maker, what do you need, they will usually tell you what they want. And the thing that they usually will ask for is data that gives them certainty so that they know what decision to make. And then you need to move that away towards shaping the needs that they have, or shaping their understanding of how to replace that want with a need. And then you can put them together with the academic expert who then can start fulfilling that need in a co-production process. So that is just some of the components of a good process that would fit into that.
That certainly fits with my experience of shaping, working with user needs and shaping that and working out what all the different bits of the organisation needing from each other, rather than what they say they want is, very, very powerful. So that works in practice. Ben, is there anything else? Okay, cool. In which case, I've got the guy in the green jumper and purple shirt.
Hello, John Huruja, consulting statistician. I think this question is mainly for Erica, but perhaps it has a wider remit as well. So, I mean, Erica, I think we all agree that the nature of the next large cyclone to hit Madagascar is radically uncertain, and that's not going to change in 5 or 10 years worth of model development. I think that's absolutely clear. What's not uncertain at all is the fact that Madagascar will be hit by a few large cyclones in the next few years. I mean, there's no uncertainty there. And there's also no uncertainty about the damage that will occur, because we've seen many cyclones impact on Madagascar already. So if the problem was radical uncertainty, why haven't we completely sidestepped the problem by focusing on building resilience rather than event management, especially when we recognize that resilience building, it gives you resilience across a wide range of disasters. So it's not just cyclones, but it's also other floods, for example, or earthquakes, whatever it might be. Why are we looking at the blockage that radical uncertainty creates in specific event management and not sidestepping the entire issue by building resilience?
That is fascinating. I imagine both Erica and Ben will have things to say about that. Should we just take the second question from it's Robert behind us?
I've been resonating with a lot of what has been said up to now around uncertainty, radical uncertainty, and acceptance, opening, failure, etc. I'm Paul Ingram from Cambridge University Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. And the clue is in the title. There is no scope for failure. I study nuclear war. I don't want nuclear war. I think that if there's one failure point, that's a deep, massive problem. So in that situation, what sort of advice do you have for people like me and those that I'm trying to interact with around how they cope with radical uncertainty when failure is not an option? And that applies to climate change in the longer run. It applies to a number of different existential threats that we study.
Oh, that's a brilliant question. Thank you, Paul. So, Erica, do you want to respond to
Yeah,
John's
okay.
question?
So the question of why don't we just do development? So essentially this is because there are different funding pots. It's a completely artificially imposed constraint. There are separate funding pots for this anticipation, for response after an event happens, for climate change adaptation, and for general development. Seasonal preparedness is also counted completely separately, and you access the funding in different ways. So yes, it's pretty silly. It doesn't really make sense, but people want to fund it in different ways. The anticipation in particular has become a big thing recently because I think people see a kind of financial opportunity essentially to fund these sorts of things via interesting financial mechanisms. And that is a pressure which does not have incentives which are aligned with reducing humanitarian impact. So yes, in an ideal world, one would kind of take all these things in the round and ultimately redistribution of wealth and development directly would be a great deal more effective, but it seems that that's politically unacceptable.
Yeah, and if the cruise pilot projects on resilience and infrastructure shows us anything, it is that resilience is very important. But resilience and what people mean by it is actually not the same across sectors. You ask an engineer, you ask an economist, they will tell you different things. And so we can agree that resilience is important, but then how do you get it inbuilt, and how do you get it valued as well? These aren't simple questions. They're actually rather complicated, and I hope that my pilot project showed that it involves a deep understanding of how funding decisions made, financing decisions and build decisions, which none of which is simple, and getting resilience in there is harder than it at first looks. So this would be my addition, not to be a naysayer, because you're absolutely right. That resilience is important in all these different ways.
Nice, brilliant, thank you. Go for it, Kris.
So I had a student 2 years ago who had a professional career as a disaster risk reduction specialist in emerging economies, and he was at King's, and he came to me and he said, "I'm really interested why I can't find any research on behavior change for decision makers. There's a lot of behavior change for the public when it comes to disaster risk response, but no one is looking at the behavior change of the senior decision makers. Why is that the case?" And so I encouraged him to research that, and he went to Turkey and he interviewed decision makers, and he found out that the decision-making context that they're experiencing in the disaster aversion situation, the proactive situation, is very different, and there's a lot of behavioral blockages there that don't exist in the responsive disaster risk context. And so the work he did took like a really solid model of behavioral insights, behavior change that looks at individual, social, and material factors that drive behavior, and applied it to these decision makers. And there is no other research out there that has done that in that particular way. There is research that identifies some of the factors, but there is no research that had looked at all of the factors together. And that's one of the blockages that is getting in the way. It's like when we're thinking about behavior change, we're usually only thinking about the public, but what we should be doing is like, what's the behavior change needed for us professionals? What do we need to change in the way that we're doing things?
Okay, I'm going to take chair's privilege here and say the way that we are in my team looking at just as much the internal behaviours as the external behaviours, but it has been a lonely road to go down because it's so unusual. But we recognise that an organisation the size and scope of the Department for Work and Pensions, if you just looked at the way that claimants were responding to us and doctors responding to us, employers, that you were missing the enormous amount of impact that we had, and that looking at how we make decisions and how we deliver on those decisions was at least important. So that's why our focus has been less on how you present options to the public and more on how you design processes, policies, strategies in the first place, and how you can make those more likely to account for people's behaviour better and make better assumptions. So music to my ears to have an excuse to chip that in. But that question about existential risk and how to sort of emotionally cope with a situation where it is both uncertain and yet only one outcome, or rather there is an outcome which cannot be accepted. Any thoughts on how you might manage that?
Sure. I mean, I'm not sure I can give an answer on all existential threats, and obviously not on specialist or nuclear war, but I think maybe one thing that's encouraging, right, is even though nuclear war seems binary, interactions between the participants are not, right? So they have loads and loads of interactions of smaller conflicts about where they learn about each other, what are their boundaries, how far can I push, right? And we have successfully avoided nuclear war for the last 60 years. So I think there has been enormous learning by the militaries about, what is acceptable, what is not, and clearly with new leaderships, these change. But I think maybe what is helpful is not to think of a binary thing where it's either one or failure, but there can be failure at lower levels, which will then smaller level conflicts, which will contribute to the learning that you will never reach the stage, right? And you don't go from no aggression to nuclear war. There will be many stages in between, and I think it's the management of those stages. But obviously, that's radically uncertain.
So I think maybe talking about sort of second, third, fourth order effects and being able to see how those sort of knock on to things. Yeah, great.
And maybe on the climate change side as well, given that I don't know much about nuclear war. I mean, if failure isn't an option, then we need to start saying so, right? Because everything that is in the current debate about climate change suggests that failure is an option. It is acceptable. We're happy to accept a 33% chance of failing to stay within the Paris Agreement. We're happy to sort of accept that policies may not be committed to, they may not be achieved. If failure wasn't an option, that should be a political commitment, right? I mean, failure clearly is an option and it's likely to happen. What does failure mean? Is it failure to stay within these targets? Is it failure to prevent deaths and destructions and economic collapse? Is it failure to, prevent certain things happening? Is it failure to take advantage of opportunities? Is it failure to create a better world? What do we mean by failure? And maybe nuclear war is a little bit binary, perhaps not particularly binary. Climate change is not at all binary because we fade into different stages of failure or opportunity. So I think it's perhaps not a very well-posed question, and I'd invite others to think about what we mean by failure there in that kind of context.
Great. Any other thoughts? No.
Yeah. So it's the question about existential threat. I think it allows us to critique a little bit some of the things that we've already said about processes and making processes better and failing better, but at least we can defend the process that we took, because you're right, some outcomes are absolutely unacceptable, and I don't know what the role then of academics or people who are advising decision makers is, but maybe in order to get them to live with and project into the most unacceptable of possible failures might be a thing to do, and I'm not sure what the mechanisms for that would be. But you're absolutely right. There is such a thing as absolutely unacceptable failure, whatever the process is.
Yeah, really. Go for it.
So there's a lot of research in the psychology of health in particular that has looked at the effect of using scary messages to get people to understand the problem and then drive action, and most of that was, of course, done with the public. And that research shows that the only time that scary messages work is when you give people the way out, where they can do something that takes away the threat. Now, when I started to work on climate, I ran into civil servants who said, well, we as civil servants have the obligation to really look the threat in the face, and we need to then articulate that to our superiors and to our ministers as well. And we started to experiment with that amongst other things, in shaping the climate change risk assessment report that Chatham House published last year. And we see that decision makers, of course, are humans and react in exactly the same way as the participants in the health psychology research that has its roots in the 1970s and has been going on ever since. So it really just showing more and more of the existential threat is not going to drive the action. The only thing that can drive the action is giving them the way out. And then you can use the existential threat. But you first need to create the way out for them. And we can't do that as academics alone. You need to do that in co-production with a whole bunch of experts and a whole bunch of policymakers. But we need to do that together, and we need to create that way out before we ramp up the messaging around the existential threat. Because the Code Red for Humanity messaging is not having the desired effects. It is leading exactly to the fragmented landscape that we are seeing today. You create disavowal and denial when you show scary messages to people in those who don't want to engage with the scariness of the message. And you might spur some action in some of them, but certainly not in all of them.
It's really practical help. Thank you. Okay, any questions from the floor? Cannot be that it's all gone really quiet. David, come on.
So I'd just like to make a small point going back to the question of success and failure of decision. I think probably the key point is we've got to stop generalizing. So I do think that context is everything. So for example, the market does very well if we're talking about restaurants or hairdressers. You know, you don't want it, you don't go. and in London, at least, the standard of restaurants has massively improved in my lifetime as a result of the market operating well. But with other things, markets don't operate so well, and we know that. And at that point, the difference between a market and a bureaucratic operation isn't necessarily so large. And the underlying problem, if we stay to, you know, not just such catastrophic decisions, but is if things are uncertain, the only sensible way to approach them is the recognition that there will be failure. And on the whole, I think you could make the case for the fact that we don't fail enough. Now, you don't really want to fail big. So that's a second possible lesson, is that you try and fail small. So, for example, the UK is the most centralized country in the OECD, and we insist on, you know, always doing everything basically for the country as a whole and not allowing regional experimentation. And we don't allow regions to have any kind of, on the whole, to have control over their own expenditure, to benefit if they manage to do better. And so if that's one example, but there are numerous others. And part of the problem here is when, for example, governments have tried to give, you know, school heads more possibility to innovate and fail, or hospitals, then everybody gets terribly concerned when they fail. I think, you know, which is natural. But we need to address this a bit more head-on and to get away from the idea that everything can be successful and there's a right answer, because economics pretty much can tell you that if you get innovation, you will fail. There'll be lots of failures, but the end level will be much higher. And so we need to get this across, I think, and we need to be trying to encourage small-scale experiments, and the idea that all decision-making, so I'm now generalizing actually, but depending on the context, you want to go for something that is experimental, and that means paying attention to getting good ways of getting feedback. Now, all that I was saying this morning, it was this morning, wasn't it, about divided states and managing the emotions of failure, these things have got to be managed. And politicians, I mean, when politicians try and claim it, that everything they do is successful. They are causing trouble for themselves and for us, because actually half the problems they're trying to engage with, there's no way you can be successful. And Mervyn might want to talk about this later. But so I think, how do we create smaller scale, more experimental, so as it gets more like restaurants and hairdressers, where you can get feedback? I mean, you probably can devise ways of getting feedback within bureaucracies if what you're trying to do can be measured a bit better. So there's a huge scope for better measurement, because price only does well in some situations.
That is really fantastic. And definitely that kind of sense of creating spaces that are safe to fail. It definitely resonates with sort of using design approaches and agile project management techniques and things. So I wonder if sometimes it also runs up against that sense of efficiency. So you don't want to be spending money on something that didn't work. Even if you don't feel like you've done the wrong thing, it still feels inefficient. But I can totally support that. Any thoughts from the panel? Go for it, Kris.
So George Osborne admitted what you just said once he was out of office. He said we tie ourselves in a knot with always wanting to be perfect. So he couldn't say it while he was in office. We've talked about wicked problems a lot over the last 2 days. And in the academic literature on wicked problems, they talk about sloppy solutions. And sloppy solutions are exactly what you describe. It's not that they are ill-thought-out solutions. It's that you're trying many things in parallel, expecting that a lot of these will fail, but that the ones that do succeed are the ones that will start making the difference. So we can't talk about wicked problems without forgetting about the solution side as well.
Great. Go for it, Ben.
Yeah, I love that question, David. It ties together nicely with Trevor's. I think we have to change our attitude to failure somehow. Talking about widespread cultural change is such a tricky thing, but I think we do. And I always encourage my students in anthropology to write about failures, just starting from the ground up to do that, and talk a lot about the anthropology of failure. I hope that my career isn't an example of the anthropology of failure, very much. There's a great ethnographer called Paul Rabinow, who wrote 2 books within a couple of years of each other. One of them was about his fieldwork in Morocco, and it's this very functional ethnography. Moroccans do this, Moroccans do that, Moroccans do this. The second book is called Reflections on Fieldwork in Morocco, and it's all about the failures, everything that went wrong, things that he couldn't work out, connections that were missed, things that he didn't understand, poor relationships in the field. And it's a very important book in the discipline because it turned anthropology at least partially around to the idea that ethnographers are certainly imperfect when it comes to their understanding. So that would be my reflection. Something pretty major has to happen there, and I don't quite know how.
Great. And oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just one more. I mean, I completely agree with David. Just I want to pick up on this point, right? That context is everything, and it's sort of small-scale failures. And I mean, one of the ways I think about it is, right? I mean, venture capital is essentially small-scale failures, right? You invest in lots of little things and you hope for that one home run. But that's for early stage. That's not a business model you can use for HS2, right? And that's why context is so important. But I think, yeah, so that's just one thing I wanted to say.
No, thank you, brilliant.
Just wanted to add, if I may, on this perspective, because I think it's a terribly important point, David. And I didn't have the time this morning to cover it from the point of view of biology. So I talked about how, we grow up out of homeostatic, sort of reactive, corrective mechanisms to more mature, counterfactual, uncertain ways of accepting differences and similarities with others. There is a stage I didn't have time to cover, which I think is very important in this discussion, and that's the stage of playing. So when we, offload our allostasis to caregivers, when as children we allow others to keep us safe, what we do with these resources that the brain needs is trial and error, ideally in role-playing situations, multisensory, kids play a lot. As soon as you leave them alone, that's what they want to do. And so perhaps the solution here is, again, I want to reinforce this because we did have existential threats. We can only do that when we allow a certain degree of collaboration and safeguarding. So if we distribute the risk and the damage and the loss between us, and we collaborate. We can allow some, ideally the young, not us, as we age, we become more risk averse. So ideally the young, we allow them to fail a little bit more and we take care of them.
That's fabulous. John.
I mean, this discussion goes directly to what I was trying to get at earlier, and I think what David said a few moments ago is vitally important. This is what I call disciplined pluralism, which means that we undergo lots of experiments. Many of these will fail, and we have honest and rapid feedback. And the characteristic, you asked, does this work in relation to HS2? I think the lesson from that is probably we shouldn't be doing things like HS2. Or if we are, we should be very sure that in a world of radical uncertainty, that they are going to be successful projects in relation to the scale of expenditure involved. I was really put in mind of this last week when Keir Starmer started talking about Great British Energy, which would pioneer low-carbon technologies and create export markets around the world. We've heard that playbook before. We had Great British Energy. It was called the Central Electricity Generating Board. And in the 1960s, it was going to be the nuclear pioneer of the world, build advanced gas-cooled reactors, which would then be exported around the world. It's not just that none of that happened, but it's also that we spent £50 billion on it not happening. And more than that, there was no honest feedback on the essential failures of the program. It was only when they tried to privatize the industry in the late 1980s that it was discovered that half these stations didn't work and had never worked properly. It was only discovered that recognized then that we didn't need most of the electricity they were going to produce anyway. It was one of the worst commercial projects in history. And there were two aspects to that failure. One was that it was done on too large a scale, and secondly, that when it was done on too large a scale, there wasn't honest feedback on the failures of the project. That's what we need to learn, and that's why large bureaucracies in both the private and public sector are typically so bad at managing the kind of things we need in conditions of radical uncertainty to solve the kind of problems we're talking about.
That's really, really helpful. So we've got the kind of play-based sharing, how we can use that to take more risks. We've got whether bureaucracies are capable of the right kind of feedback loops. And should we be doing things like HS2? I also saw online, I think it says Lenny, I'm guessing it's the same Lenny that you've written it down here, but that we've had situations where we've been able to get out of existential threats like nuclear war, we could have decommissioned the bombs, climate change, there were certainly easier and cheaper options in the 90s. So even when there are options and we know that it's existential, we still don't seem to take them. So there seems to be some barriers to collective decision-making that perhaps we'd be useful to highlight here and figure out how we can dismantle them. But I thought worth bringing those three together and see if the panel had any reflections. Go for it.
I mean, maybe what that brings up for me is the question of misaligned interests, where if we're giving examples of poor decision-making and failure to take this kind of opportunity, that's not just accidental, is it? It's because there were vested interests who benefited from the way that things were in the other scenario.
Yeah, definitely. That makes perfect sense to me.
I mean, maybe I just gonna pick up John's point, and I appreciate, right, and I appreciate what he's saying, but at the same time, climate change seems to impose upon us a nearly unprecedented need for investment. And I'm unsure whether you can purely have that through private decentralized enterprise, whether that is going to avoid some of the most catastrophic effects of what we are saving. So if we're saying that large bureaucracies are incapable of doing very large investment projects, I feel like we urgently need to figure out in which a way in which they can, because I feel like that is what will be required in order to prevent some of the worst scenarios from happening.
There's something about, to pick up on your example, John, about the way that indeed the decision-making structure can either be centralized or decentralized. And it's really interesting that many local councils are actually starting to look at community energy schemes that are the completely decentralized version of the great British energy company that you mentioned. So that's one way that you can decentralize, but the technology you're pushing itself is either centralized or decentralized, and nuclear energy has the big problem that all of the plans are really big and you don't have a tight feedback loop between implementation and failure and learning from that. And we worked with a team in Oxford that is looking at modeling the historical costs of energy technologies and projecting that forward into the future. Cameron Hepburn's team and Doyne Farmer. And what they saw in looking at all of the data that is available about energy technology costs is that distributed energy technologies like wind and solar and batteries and hydrogen production and all of that are on a declining cost curve precisely because they have a rapid feedback loop where you learn by doing, and nuclear isn't. Nuclear has been flat since the 1950s in terms of costs, and the reason is that you can't learn from the previous thing that you build, because by the time you start building the next one, all the staff has retired and you need to relearn everything that you learned in the first one. So there is these different ways that we can think about decentralization, about pursuing that.
And since I've got the microphone, nuclear plants don't have to be huge. They are huge because these are the plants which ministers want to build. And equally, we have an absence in that sector of honest feedback. We have the bizarre story that the French government has just renationalized EDF. It's essentially renationalized EDF in order to avoid having to disclose the problems that are associated with French nuclear plants at the moment. One can't say too often, we need smaller scale, we need lots of experiments, and we need honest processes of feedback to learn from these experiments. And that's what David's restaurants and market forces do well, and we have to replicate doing that well in these other areas.
Yeah, I'd just like to agree with that. One of the things that we found in our work on infrastructure and then some subsequent work on infrastructure financing was a kind of enchantment of scale, people wanting larger interventions and innovations that were associated specifically with them quite often. And in fact, there was somebody at a particular meeting who said the phrase, "I've become intoxicated by the power of big infrastructure," which I think just sort of summarised what we're talking about here. That was...
That's great. Yes, question right there. No,
Hi, a bit like I said a bit earlier, I run a small business, and I think one of the things I'd say, the way we react to uncertain events actually happening, is you've got to just be really adaptive, adapt very quickly when they happen. And I think what John was saying kind of resonates with me, because my sense is I've also worked in big businesses, and it's much more difficult for big organizations to adapt quickly to unusual things happening. On the other hand, just to sort of confuse matters, I think what also happens with smaller businesses like ours is radical events are much more binary for us because we don't have the scale. I guess sometimes scale helps and sometimes it doesn't. And perhaps in larger scale organizations, if they can learn to be sort of very adaptive, is kind of really what we've got to be able to do.
That's really interesting. Okay, David.
This is a slightly different question, but when we funded the projects, of which we have 4 representatives here, and there were a number of others, they were in many ways quite experimental. If we're thinking about experiments that worked and experiments that failed, there's 2 ways in which that could be understood for those who did them. first of all, did it deliver? Was it useful? Secondly, it sat in a very different academic space. So it could have been a failure from career points of view for those who did them. So I was wondering what the reflections were of the 4 individual project folks about the kind of value of this kind of work, because if they see it as valuable both for themselves and for those they worked with, and they had honest feedback about it. I mean, Ben showed some remarks this morning, that offers a degree of promise for the future.
I think we should go with that one.
Yeah, I'm happy to start there, because I think that shows that we do make a dangerous binary out of success and failure. I think that there are successes and failures and all kinds of different kinds of things that you could value and regimes of value that could be in conflict in the projects that we did. And from a career point of view, yeah, it led rather directly to other work that was interesting, further work in infrastructure with a couple of economist colleagues, and then the work on policing that happened later, because at the last cruise conference I was sat next to Mark Fenton-O'Creevy, and then I got a surprising phone call one summer asking me to look at police in the pandemic. And so I think that quite often we do try to decide whether or not a 6-month project is a success or a failure. I think that's almost impossible, because it has these tendrils that reach out. There are sort of personal and professional impacts of these, and you don't know for sometimes quite a long time afterwards what they might be. So there's my reflection on it. Personally, I think given the time that we had, you can chalk up a lot of success to what these short projects managed. I'm not blowing my own trumpet, I'm thinking more about the rest of the panel, but I think there was an awful lot done in a very short period of time there.
Would you like to go next, Kris?
So similarly mixed answer to Ben in the sense that yes, we know the outcomes from that particular project disappeared in the turmoil of Operation Yellowhammer. Our team disappeared, like Ben's team did, in the Brexit turmoil. So our immediate recommendations didn't find any ground at that moment. But how did it play out in other domains? Very successful, because it's about developing a new, innovating the way that academia operates and works with other sectors in society. And as a tool and a platform that we were allowed to play with and to experiment with in that project, when we then came to situations like the problem that we observed in the Chatham House project, where the climate risk information wasn't cutting through, we said, we've got a tool that we want to try on this, and can we please try this? And we send them the blueprint and the findings of SHUTDOWN to convince them of what it would look like. And it worked. They said, yes, you can go ahead with it. And so that's the next trial in the trial and error process, and it will hopefully lead to more in the future.
That's fantastic.
Maybe I can start with that question at the back, actually, and lead on to the other one. And, you know, if you're a small business and you fail, then that's difficult for you, right? And that comes to David's question about schools and hospitals. You know, if you are a child in that school or a cancer patient in that hospital, then you experience that failure, and it might be catastrophic. Where the policymaker takes a bird's eye view and looks at everybody and says, oh, in the round, this is okay, we do better overall if a few of them fail. But if you are in that situation, you experience it very differently, right? And, you know, that then comes to Kat's point about play and the safeguarding in the event of these failures. How do we ensure that if we are going to set ourselves up to experience these failures for the benefit of the system overall, then the system overall also has to take responsibility for cushioning and safeguarding those who are affected by the failures. So then on the projects, I mean, was it a failure? So in academic terms, I didn't write any papers about it, so that would count as an academic failure and certainly a black mark against my academic career, but I certainly think it was well worth doing and has led to further work, and you know, that perhaps that comes around tangentially to improve an academic career, I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, I think you shouldn't be asking the people that did it, you should be asking the stakeholders who were sort of involved with the on-the-ground implementation and learning that came after it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I mean, these were all brilliant questions and comments. I mean, maybe just once more to go back to David's point, right, that context is everything. I mean, I do want to make the point that sometimes maybe big is needed. I mean, Mervyn can obviously disagree, but I don't think we would have been in a good position if during the financial crisis we would have had a small central bank, right? It was only the expansion of the central bank to unprecedented sizes that allows us to stabilize the financial system. So I think for certain kinds of problem, very large institutions in terms of resources are needed, but for others maybe not. But I think, yeah, so it's a question of context. In terms of the academic career question, I think that's a really tough question. So similar to Erica, I really enjoyed the work. I mean, I think it was useful to the organization I work with, but again, we should probably ask them. The problem is, right, so in terms of social science, it's in the kind of social science journals I'm expected to publish, it is nearly impossible to translate this kind of practical work into an academic article that would be of interest, right? It's too much impact, too real world. It doesn't engage with the long-running academic debates. It's too empirical. So, I mean, I've tried to publish a couple of these things, but they were basically rejected everywhere. So I think that's something, you know, where maybe the academy also has to reflect on what do we currently publish in sort of the journals in our fields.
Brilliant, thank you. Did you?
I was going to say, maybe, Tobias, you need to write a book.
And I do think there could be a role for academia in helping to hold some of this knowledge management problem that has come up in multiple projects, and certainly in my own world. If we could share and externalize and then have a repository of some of this knowledge. But it's certainly been a fascinating conversation, and I can sort of see the challenges of zooming out to see the whole, but then you need to zoom in to see what's going on the ground, and then the question of scale. If you have it small enough, it can fail, but if it fails, what happens to the people in it? And these are not straightforward questions, but I think we've had an awful lot of great conversation here today, great questions from the audience and from online as well. Thank you so much to the panel, and if everybody could give a round of applause to our speakers. And I'll now hand over to, we'll just take 2 minutes to switch over to David and Mervyn.